During the Second World War, the Allies joined forces with the Soviet Union to fight their common German enemy. After the war, however, ideological differences between each side, along with contrasting plans for the future of post-war Germany, caused tensions to rise. Tensions peaked when, in response to the Allies uniting their sectors of Germany into one trizone, the Soviets created a blockade along the east-west German border, cutting off West Berlin. The Allies overcame this barrier with an airlift, carrying 4,000 tons of supplies by air to Berlin each day. The airlift continued for almost a year until the Soviets lifted the blockade, their attempt to starve out Berlin failing. After the airlift, tensions were still high. The events of the Berlin airlift allowed the Allies to keep control over the future of Germany, created a common enemy out of the Soviets for the democratic countries of Europe to unite against, and directly led to the creation of NATO. In June 1941, the German army invaded the Soviet Union, breaking their non-aggression pact. This caused the Soviet Union, Britain, and the US to sign the Anglo-Soviet Agreement, pledging to abstain from individually making peace with Germany. This was an important ideological barrier being broken, as the Democratic Allies and the Communist Soviet Union put aside their ideological differences in order to unite against their common enemy. Near the end of the war, in February of 1945, the Allied leaders met at the Yalta Conference to decide the fate of Germany, mainly how it would be divided between the Allies and what to do with the liberated countries in Europe. This was groundbreaking in the way that Joseph Stalin was included in these conferences, despite his opposing ideology to the other Allied leaders. There were some disagreements between the Allies and Joseph Stalin, mainly caused by their opposing ideologies. Despite this, World War II ended with the Soviet Union and Allies working together in rebuilding post-war Europe. Franklin D. Roosevelt made the statement at Yalta, "Never before have the major Allies been more closely united, not only in their war aims but also in their peace aims." In mid-July of 1945, the Allied leaders would meet again at the Potsdam Conference to discuss the occupation of Austria, the demarcation of Poland, and the Soviet Union's role in Eastern Europe. The 4 occupation zones of Germany were also set up at Potsdam, along with the Allied Control Council to have overall joint authority over the country. In an early example of post-war Soviet expansionism, Joseph Stalin refused to let the Allies directly interfere with Eastern Europe, as Bulgaria, Romania, and Hungary were all controlled by communists, though he did agree to let them have free elections. Tensions began to rise in 1946 when it came out that Stalin had not kept his promise to let the countries in Eastern Europe have free elections, and had instead suppressed any and all democratic parties, ensuring a communist government was put into place. The ideological barrier between the Soviet Union and the Allies was being rebuilt after Europe was freed from wartime conditions, and tensions would only continue to rise. In 1948, the Allies were secretly making plans to unite their sectors of Germany into a single trizone in order to further develop the growing economy. When Stalin found out, he left the Allied Control Council in protest. Having been invaded twice within the last 40 years, a strong Germany was the last thing the Soviets wanted. The once unified post-war German state had now been split into 2 opposing sides, East and West Germany. In response to Joseph Stalin leaving the Allied Control Council, the Allies released the Deutschmark, a new form of currency in West Germany, which would also be effective in both West and East Berlin. In response to this, on June 23, 1948, Soviet troops created a blockade along the east-west German border, cutting off West Berlin from the Allies. The Soviets' intent was to starve out West Berlin, forcing it to be surrendered to them. The Allies wanted to avoid another war, so solving the issue militarily was not an option. Instead, they decided to attempt to overcome this barrier by supplying Berlin via an airlift, carrying supplies to the city by air. Berlin would need 4,000 tons of supplies per day to prevent its collapse, which will require 1,300 individual flights per day. The first flights of the airlift commenced on June 26th, and despite threats from the Soviets, the planes landed safely in Berlin. The airlift had many other issues, however. They did not have enough planes nor crew members to effectively supply Berlin. For the first weeks of the airlift, the Allies could only manage to deliver 1,000 tons of supplies per day, 1/4 of the required amount. On top of a lack of crew and planes, the conditions the pilots operated under were dangerous. The airfield they had to land on was nothing more than a grass field, and pilots often suffered from fatigue due to the long flights. The airlift was eventually brought under control. Strict timing schedules for the airlift were set up, maximizing the efficiency of which the supplies were delivered. The antiquated C-47s that were previously being used were replaced with newer C-54s, and pilots were routinely rotated in and out of planes to minimize fatigue. Here is Charles Devonshire speaking about his experience with the routine the pilots went through.
Well, the going into Berlin was set up that they developed crews. They match a crew up. And that crew would fly 2 round trips to Berlin. Then you would get off and you go back to the barracks where we stayed. And at that point, we went to the bottom of the list. You had free time until your name worked its way up to the top of the list.
On August 12th, the airlift finally reached its goal of 4,000 tons per day. The airlift became a huge success, and at some point supplied the city more than it had ever been by rail. By 1949, it was clear that the Soviets' plan had backfired on them. The blockade officially ended in May of 1949, and the airlift concluded in November, after delivering a total of 2.4 million tons of supplies to Berlin during its operation. The barrier between Berlin and the Allies had finally been broken. After such a successful retaliation to the blockade, Europe would not soon forget the Berlin airlift. The Soviets' attempt to take control of Berlin was a complete failure. Despite the lackluster performance of the airlift in its first weeks, it inspired people across Europe. An opportunity the Allies took advantage of to gain publicity for the airlift was the Candy Bomber project. It started when Gail Halverson, a pilot, began to routinely give his candy ration to the children watching the planes land at the airfield. When his supervisors found out about this, they decided to take the opportunity to gain support for the airlift. Candy donations poured in from the United States, and soon candy was being dropped from planes in multiple locations across West Berlin. Kate M. O'Connell, a historian, wrote, "By framing the story as an act of heroism benefiting innocent children, Americans overcame the residual hostilities of the occupation and fostered a new relationship with the former enemy."
And I said, "Give me your rations. I'll be responsible. I got to have your rations." I got 30 kids. And of course, the next day, came over the airport. And there down that open place, between the bombed-out buildings and the barbed wire fence, were those 30 kids right in a bunch. And so Elkins, I told him, when I tell you, when my hand comes down, push those 3 chutes out that flare chute. I said, push it out. And immediately almost were over the fence.
The success of the airlift was a great opportunity for Allied propaganda, allowing them to gain support across Europe and demonize the Soviets. It also emboldened anti-Soviet politicians within Berlin and decreased the popularity of the Soviet agenda more than ever. Berlin elected a democratic mayor into office, a clear protest against the idea of communist control. The barrier between the powers occupying Germany and its people had been broken, and united people against the now Soviet common enemy. The actions of the Soviet Union that led to the Berlin airlift united Western Europe against the Soviet agenda. The unification of the Allied sectors of Germany, along with the events of the Berlin airlift, led to the creation of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. This was to guarantee security between the democratic countries against the Soviet Union, in case war ever did break out. Soon after, West Germany formally became its own country, followed closely by East Germany in response. The Berlin airlift marked a turning point for Europe and the beginning of the Cold War. Within the following years, more conflict would arise in the divided Berlin. The events of the Berlin airlift influenced many people in the communist East Germany to immigrate to West Germany through Berlin, causing the Berlin Wall to be erected in 1961 to prevent East German citizens from migrating into the democratic West Germany. Had Berlin fallen to the Soviets, they would have had a significant upper hand in deciding the fate of Europe, with the German capital being completely in their hands. The Berlin airlift helped unify not only Germany but Western Europe against the Soviets, and allowed the Allies to have an upper hand in preventing Soviet expansionism in later years.